Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our 10-week series on evangelism, which is inspired by the J. Mack Stiles book, How Do I Get Started in Evangelism? Today, we're going to talk about the importance of speaking the gospel, which you read about in pages 23 through 26 of the book. Now, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 11, Paul says, "Knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade others." And this passage is a key part of our definition of evangelism. Remember that we are in the business of persuading others with the truth of the gospel. And since the gospel is a message, we must articulate it in words. We can't fall into the very common trap of thinking that living a good life is enough. Now, of course, we should live godly lives, but good deeds alone won't ever make people think of Jesus or lead them to salvation. Saying that you can share the gospel without words is like saying you can feed people without giving them food. Now, for many of us, speaking the gospel is where we're going to struggle the most. We either don't say anything about it, or we don't speak in ways that naturally lead to gospel conversations. The author says that for him, evangelism always feels like pushing a ball uphill. He says that every time he has an opportunity to share his faith, he has to decide to speak up. And you will need to do the same thing. We all need to take that risky step and speak. Remember, awkwardness is always better than silence. And the more we talk about the gospel, the more natural it's going to become in our conversation. So we now can ask that question: how can you get started? Well, the author says, try asking a question like this: could I explain the core message of the Christian faith to you? I promise it only takes a minute. Now, I know that can be challenging, because there's been many times in my life and the author's life when I could have brought up the gospel, but didn't. He says, instead of saying something like, I met someone yesterday, try changing your phrasing. Try saying, I met someone yesterday at my church. See, if you are intentional with your words, you never know where it could lead. The author shares a wonderful story about him speaking with a young man from Scotland, and that young man asked him what he did for work. Stiles said that he was a pastor in Iraq. And the young man stared at him very wide-eyed and asked a question that you could probably guess: why would you ever want to do that? And he said that he could have answered in many different ways, but he ended up thinking about it for a second and saying, well, the bottom line is, I genuinely, deep in my heart, am convinced that Jesus got up from the dead. He said that the young man's reaction was priceless, that he looked very thoughtful, and after a few seconds said, well, fair enough. And that was a great point for starting a conversation about the gospel. Stiles continued by asking that question we mentioned earlier: could I explain the core beliefs of the Christian faith to you? I promise it only takes a minute. And then that opened the door to some deeper discussions. I want to thank you again so much for joining us today. Remember, speaking the gospel is essential. I want to encourage you, take that step, speak up, and watch how God uses your words to touch hearts. Please stay tuned for our next session, where we'll talk about living our faith as we read through pages 26 through 30. We'll see you all very soon. God bless you all.